So, today I want to talk about Tyson Foods and betting on workers' lives. 2020 has been a year that has highlighted a lot of the problems of capitalism. This pandemic, this COVID-19 pandemic, has been a huge magnifying glass on a lot of the problems and disconnects of capitalism between the upper echelons of management and owners to the positions and status of workers. And when I get an article like this one where Tyson Foods fires 7 plant managers over betting on workers getting COVID-19, I can't think of a better way to summarize 2020. The pandemic response has been one where we've constantly been gambling the lives of people on the altar of capitalism to keep the economy open in the name of business interest throughout the entirety of the situation. And if you want a representation of how management and, employers and even the federal government worries about employees, just take a look at this story as a context, as a minor window into the larger way that capitalism views workers. They don't care. They don't give anything to workers. And they just do not care if people are alive or dead. We control, as a society, the lives of people. And because they are dependent on the financial backing of corporations, corporations can play with their lives like puppets on a string. With that said, let's take a look at what has transpired in these particular cases. So, setting the framework of everything. You have a situation where more than 1,000 employees at a plant in Waterloo, Iowa, had been infected by the virus. At least 6 had died. The virus had spread across the community. Black Hawk County had seen some 12,000 cases and 193 deaths. Many of the plant's 2,800 employees were immigrants and refugees. And in April, the sheriff of Black Hawk, Tony Thompson, had actually asked for the facility and lobbied for Tyson to close the plant, but the company, of course, refused. It's around this time that the complaints of certain families of the employees, one specific employee member who died, started talking about the manager of the Waterloo facility organizing, quote, a cash buy-in, winner-take-all betting pool for supervisors and managers to wager how many employees would test positive for COVID-19. Now, Tyson has actually had employees move between a different plant in Iowa, where an outbreak was occurring, and this Waterloo plant, and did not adequately test or quarantine anybody while they transferred between facilities. At the same time, Tyson offered a $500 thank you bonus to employees who showed up for every scheduled shift for the 3-month period, a policy that is being argued incentivized sick workers to keep working. So, as usual, you have this situation where workers are being asked to come in even if they're sick, because that $500 can make a huge difference in people's lives. It's almost as if when you have people dependent on a system and a company for their well-being, they will take any scraps they can and even try to put themselves and their coworkers at risk for just a little bit more of the scrap that the company gives them out of what they should be paid. This is not a good practice, and this is a continued practice that consistently occurs. We're working harder, breaking your boundaries, and overall just pushing past your limits is rewarded for just a little bit more of a measly scrap to get by. And so when we look at the actual situation that's going on with management, most of the managers are not talking about all this because they're currently wrapped up in the litigation around people dying. But you have one particular manager who actually is speaking out. And this particular manager basically said, and I quote, "The office pool was spontaneous fun and intended to boost morale," and is trying to make the claim, this Don Merschbrock, that they are not evil people that, like Tyson has portrayed them. Now I'm going to get to Tyson in a minute because Tyson's hands are not clean in this situation at all. And the manager does have a point about that. But that doesn't mean that there's any excuse to justify literally betting on a human life. This is just another symptom of the lack of care for employees that you find under capitalism, and more importantly, the disconnect between management and workers. How is this fun? In what reality is it fun to make your workers the punchline of your little game, while you're betting on whether or not they should be alive or dead? This doesn't ring as anything good. As a matter of fact, this feels dystopian. This feels like I'm looking at the precursor of the Hunger Games, where we're betting on whether or not people are going to live or die. And this is something that occurs throughout capitalism, whether it be futures exchanges or what I'm going to come to in a little bit with Tyson, the type of life insurance that they tend to take out. Companies like this tend to take out dead peasants insurance. But we'll get to that. So the managers were trying to pool whether or not the mass testing at the facility was supposed to work or not. And that lawyers from this case that's, currently in litigation have basically portrayed it that they were betting, and the betting was indicative of the company's overall callous attitude towards health and safety, which, as we saw by putting forward a policy that encouraged workers to come into work and not shutting down the facility despite the sheriff's request, you ended up with a situation where they did, in fact, prioritize finances over the health and safety of workers. Shocker, but that's what companies do in a pandemic. And they've alleged that all of this downplayed the virus, they downplayed security, and essentially that the employees were encouraged to work while sick, which we've seen. But when we go back to what Merschbrock has to say, he says the office pool involved roughly $50 cash, which went to the winner, who picked the correct percentage of workers testing positive for the virus. He added that those involved didn't believe that the pool violated company policy and thought the plan's positivity rate would be lower than the community rate due to their mitigation efforts. It was a group of exhausted supervisors that had worked so hard and so smart to solve many unsolvable problems. It was simply something fun, kind of a morale boost for having to put forth an incredible effort. There was never any malicious intent. It was never meant to disparage anyone. And the lawyers have basically said that this was not an unsolvable problem, and that anyone who's lost family knows that this was, strictly speaking, a position of corporate culture trying to prioritize production and sales while treating workers as expendable. And so we have this situation where Tyson management was putting this forward. And again, I can't understand the perspective of these managers and why it is that they feel like they can bet on human life in this particular way. I don't see what's fun about this. I don't see why this was a morale boost for them. If anything, they should have been appealing and speaking to the fact that their businesses really should have been closed. And I get, on some level, as a manager, this is not entirely on them. They were probably receiving orders from higher up, and they were probably being charged with certain positions that they had to take. So I get the position that they were probably in the middle on some level, but you can only go with the I was just following orders shtick for so long before it ends up turning into just a problem. But I do want to agree that Tyson Foods is responsible in all this. And Tyson's Food has not always had their hands clean when it has come to betting on workers and whether or not they, should live or not. And this brings us to dead peasants insurance. And while it's not entirely relevant in this particular case, it does speak to the fact that capitalism has had this problem for a while. Betting on the lives of people, whether it be through a futures exchange that wants to prioritize water, as a commodity, which I've talked about earlier this year, or whether it's this particular type of insurance, dead peasants insurance. The idea in capitalism is everything is up for grabs, and everything can be bought and sold, even human life. And so what is peasants insurance? Well, peasants insurance, as noted in this particular piece from a law firm, and written by a Patrick Burns, Peasant Revolt, Why Congress Should Eliminate Tax Benefits of Dead Peasant Insurance. The position for this type of what is known as COLI, or company-owned life insurance, the issues around it are that policies lack a legitimate insurable interest because there's often an arbitrary connection between an employee's value to a company and the financial gain that an employee makes for the company. Essentially, what that's stating is that the low-end employees are so easily replaceable that when a company takes out an insurance policy for one of these employees who are low-end wage earners, they essentially have no interest in keeping them alive, which brings us to 2, the policies create an improper incentive for employers to accelerate the death of their employees. 3, the policies are funded by American taxpayers for the benefit of both the employers and insurance companies. Yet again, you find a situation where taxpayers are funding not people, but corporations and subsidizing their positions, in this case to bet on human life, on whether or not they should functionally be able to, be kept alive. So, as I stated before, due to a lack of interest to the insured person, a company that takes out a life insurance policy on a low-wage worker creates a scenario by which an employer is incentivized for the employee to die quickly. This rationale forms the basis for the court's conclusion in a case, but in some courts, they invalidate the extreme forms of this, or, quote, dead peasant policies, that this improper incentive will usually exist in the context of COLI unless the employer has a true insurable interest in a key employee. What that's getting at is a company like Apple could have taken an insurance policy against someone like Steve Jobs because he's the face of the company, he represents a lot of its interests, and therefore taking out that policy makes sense. You have an incentive to keep Jobs alive in general because he makes you money. But if you're talking about random person on the street who barely does anything for the company in terms of the company's eyes, right? Some low-wage, $7.25 an hour person that's easily replaceable, you have an incentive to actually kill that person off because you'll make more money in the insurance claims. That's all that this is talking about. Now, I do have to say that back in 2006, there was a bill passed, a law rather passed, that changed the policy that theoretically companies have to get the permission of employees and can only do this on their highest earning 35% of employees. But as I'm about to show, this particular policy isn't necessarily easy to enforce or figure out whether or not it's being followed. Because as we find out, the 2006 congressional amendment that attempted to weaken the dead peasant policies are, basically not forcing the companies to disclose any information. Banks have to, but the fact is that most companies actually don't have to disclose what's going on within their company towards these dead peasant policies. And furthermore, to show that this is actually happening with Tyson, the Wall Street Journal identified companies that still held substantial COLI assets in 2009. And I know this is 11 years ago, but this is the most accurate information that I was able to find and come across. If anyone has anything more accurate, definitely leave a comment and let me know. But basically, you had Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, AGI, and Tyson Foods showing that the total amount of money that banks are, putting into COLI and these companies, it's likely that a lot of these companies are actually putting in and collecting billions of dollars from the death benefits of COLI. So Tyson doesn't have any sort of disconnect from betting on people's lives historically. And while these particular managers are being thrown under the bus and fired for it because they got caught, at the end of the day, that's really the issue, right? They got caught and it makes Tyson look bad. So they're put in the position where they have to cut and run and just throw these particular 7 managers on the bus. But Tyson Foods doesn't have an issue with betting on workers' lives if it makes them money. which we saw from company policies, we saw from their appeal to the federal government, and we saw from the policy they let their managers get away with for months. The fact that it's taken 9 months for this policy to have them fired means that this was okay with the company until the legality came out. And this is all just part of the parcel of capitalism right now. You know, you have an incentive in this type of insurance that I looked at for a company to place insured workers into more dangerous jobs and to spend less money on safety accommodations. And what did we see from Tyson? This exact same type of situation. Not providing the ability to social distance, not providing proper PPE, keeping the factory open when there was, virus being spread across the place, no proper quarantine procedures, creating a system where sick workers were meant to come in. And honestly, if any of these employees were found to have, these types of COLI policies put in place, I really wonder how much the company cared for these particular employees. And I can't speak on whether or not they did. That's going to be up for the law to determine. But the fact that this type of policy exists alongside the type of positions that the company has taken and the managers took represents a much bigger problem within capitalism and the way workers are viewed by management and by employers and just business owners in general. We need to stand together and start forming collective understandings in the next coming year, because capitalism does not care if we live or die. The rich are ready to eat us and to make money off of our deaths. It's time we start facing back and responding in kind. With that said, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button and bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. With that said, my name is Anarchist Tara. I really hope you have a great New Year's, and let this new year be a revitalization of leftist thinking. Let it be a position of socialism and anarchy and communism coming together and banding together in a way where we actually fight back against these systems of oppressions. Have a great day, have a great new year, and I hope you enjoyed watching.